of books, the entirety of the Old Testament. And now, as I promised, we're just going to look at the timeline. I'm not going to get into any details, but we just want to kind of see where we are in terms of time, because some of our books have overlapped. Some of our books are later than they seem, earlier than they seem. And so while I'm not going to mention every single book by name, I'm going to just try to give us a sense of where we are in history so that we can kind of put it all square in our heads. And then I'm going to give us a little sense of the history of the way the timeline of the New Testament, very briefly, so that as we get started, we can get a sense of where these books are happening, what's written before what, and so on and so forth. So the Old Testament gets started in the time of Abram, soon to be Abraham, in a place called Ur, in roughly the 20th century BC. So this is around 2,000 years BC, and everything at this point is give or take 200 years. We really do have to guess because we just don't have a solid sense of when is when. And we call this time the patristic era because there are the fathers, the era of the fathers it's sometimes called. Now, Abraham's successors, as we know, are his sons and grandson, Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob. Jacob also takes the name Israel, and Israel, of course, becomes the name of the people. And so the sons of Jacob, who are 12 in number, establish the 12 tribes of Israel, which is going to function as a family identity, all the way down through to the time of Jesus. The youngest of the sons, as we remember from the story in Genesis, is Joseph. Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers, and so he, the youngest son of Israel, goes into slavery in Egypt. That foreshadows the hundreds of years of slavery that the Jews are going to experience in Egypt, because of course we have that great line at the end of Genesis: "A Pharaoh came who knew not Joseph." That's become one of the jokes that a lot of priests say when a new bishop comes and all of a sudden he doesn't like the priest anymore who had a lot of favor from a previous bishop. A new bishop came and he knew not Joseph. And so God puts them in slavery for several hundred years in order to establish that the people do not belong to themselves, but they belong to another, ultimately to God. And so God sets up Moses to function as a savior, as a prefigurement of Jesus. Now, Moses shows up on the scene somewhere between 1500 and 1300 BC. And so the Jews as a people are about 500 years old. They have a sense of that kind of generational sense. Moses, with the help of his siblings or cousins or some kind of blood relations, Miriam and Aaron, lead about 600,000 Jews out of slavery in Egypt, across the Red Sea, and into a desert en route to the Promised Land. They get to Mount Tabor, where we are going to have the giving of the Ten Commandments. But, of course, we know things go south there, and inexplicably, Aaron, the goofball, manages to bring together all the leftover earrings and create a golden calf. This does not go well. And so the Jews sin against the Lord for the first but not the last time. And even Moses gets stung a little by their lack of faith. And so the Jews get punished to spend 40 years wandering through a remarkably small desert. It's a really small desert. We're talking about 250 miles or so, edge to edge, for 600,000 people to wander around for 40 years is not, doesn't make a lot of sense. In fact, most people, when they go to the Holy Land, the first thing they're amazed by is just how small everything is. You can stand in Jerusalem and see Bethlehem with your eyes. It's 3, 4, 5 miles away. And so none of this is all spread out. 600,000 people spread across, maybe 200 miles. That's tight fitting. That's Houston living, kind of thing. That's not as spread out as we often think it is. Somewhere between 1400 and 1200 BC, somewhere in that, Moses dies. And the people then enter the Promised Land. So 1400 to 1200 BC. At that point, we know that Joshua takes over as the leader, and we enter into the era of the judges. This is mostly covered by the historical books of the Bible, as you remember. And the judges are basically military dictators who are called by the Lord, prophet style, to step up in response to specific threats. Usually threats coming from the Assyrian Empire or whoever happens to be in Iraq or modern-day Iraq, modern-day Iran. Sometimes you have the Medes, sometimes you have different little groups, but ultimately these judges rise up as military dictators to address a specific problem. Now, the era of the judges ends with Samuel, who is the last judge and the first prophet, properly speaking. When Samuel is doing his thing, the Jews are going to ask the Lord for a king. And we remember how this story plays out. The people are scared because there's a huge rabid bulldog living next door, and that's why Samuel is considered the last judge, because he rises up and says, we need to deal with this. But the people say, we don't want judges anymore. We want a king. The Lord says, kings are bad to have. You don't want a king. No, 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 we want a king. And so what does the Lord give them? He gives them Saul. Saul is a giant stinker. We know that he's no good, but he is helpful to remember because he comes at a very, very fixed time in history. 1000 BC, we have Saul. And Saul's failure and David's ascent happens right there at 1000 BC, and it's easy to remember, and it's a nice fixed moment in history. Before this, we have kind of some stuff happening. We have some patristic people. We have the judges. But 1000 BC, King David comes to the throne. David is a man, quote, after God's own heart. And so even though David makes his mistakes, his son Solomon becomes a great king. And so we know that a lot of the wisdom literature is going to constantly reference back to King Solomon, who is doing his thing a little after 1000 BC. And now we're going to spend the next 300 years, from 1000 BC to the mid-700s BC, oscillating between good king, bad king, good king, bad king, good king, bad king. And some of the prophets, in particular folks like Jeremiah, are going to point out, I like this king, but I don't like that king. And we're going to get a lot of this kind of back and forth and between good kings and bad kings. At this same time, we're going to have prophets showing up on the scene who are going to kind of talk about and address themselves to all sorts of broad themes that we've gone over. They're also going to functionally, or I should say the prophets aren't, but in this time when these 300 years between 1000 and 700, the prophets are going to walk around, but the kings are eventually going to create a division. And there's going to be a northern kingdom in what we now call Palestine and a southern kingdom in what we now call Israel. The northern kingdom is going to include 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel, and they're going to set up shop there, and they are, generally speaking, going to do okay, but they're going to be a little less religious, and they're going to be a little bit more, we do it our own way, and you people keep it to yourselves, while the other two tribes, specifically and most importantly the tribe of Judah, are going to stay in the southern kingdom, which is where Jerusalem is, properly speaking. David is going to be the king of both kingdoms, but of course in that oscillation, there's going to be the division of the kingdoms. In the 700s BC, the king of the south, a king named Josiah, is going to get super into history. He's going to collect and edit most of everything that could be considered biblical. He's going to try to find all the history books, all the prophets, and he's going to have kind of definitive edits of these books put together so that he can say, you see my binders? They're gorgeous. I've got these beautiful binders on my shelf with all the good Bible stuff in it. And he is going to be an incredibly important person because he is the one who is going to be able to kind of say, this is the inspired word of God. Now, the challenge, of course, is he's having these editors kind of pick and choose the parts they want. And so we're getting certainly a very slightly edited bent on some of these books. Certain chapters, I'm sure, were thrown away. Other chapters were added, and we've talked about that and why that's important and how we can still get at what the books originally said, even with that. Now, as Josiah is doing his stuff in the northern kingdom in the 700s BC and the 800s BC, this is when the northern kingdom has decided they're going to pick a fight with the big giant rabid bulldog next door, the Assyrian Empire. And the Assyrian Empire is going to walk up and slap them across the face and completely destroy the northern kingdom. And 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel are basically going to be lost to history. The surviving people who are scattered around the Middle East from modern-day Egypt all the way up to modern-day Syria, all the way over to modern-day Turkey, and maybe even India, that's where they're going to go. It's going to be spread out, and they're going to call themselves the Jewish diaspora, from the Latin word for spread out. But the term is ultimately going to be co-opted later, and today we apply the term the Jewish diaspora to anybody of Jewish heritage not living in Israel. And so when you ever hear the word diaspora, that's what it means. We went over that before. Now, after the northern conquering in the 700s BC, then we're going to be left with the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Aaron. Now, 100 years later, the Assyrian Empire, which had been the big power in the universe there from 2200 BC all the way down, actually from 30-something, 3000s BC, all the way down until the mid-700s BC, is going to be suddenly and unexpectedly conquered, and the Assyrians are going to go away, and the Babylonians are going to show up on the scene. The Babylonians are centered in modern-day Iraq, whereas the Assyrians were centered in modern-day Iran. Some drama never really ends. And so the Babylonian Empire is going to come in, and they're not going to need to be provoked. They're just going to come in and say, hi, we're in charge now. We're going to run your country. The Jews say, no, you're not. And in 587, it turns out, yes, they are. And so the Jews are conquered, and the last of the peoples of the promised land are carted off to Babylon. And so we enter into the Babylonian exile. This is the single most important event between 1000 BC and the coming of Jesus, and it is a giant deal because a pile of prophets are going to rise up and they're going to remind the Jewish people that, hey, y'all have screwed up in the past, you continually sin against the Lord, this is a punishment, but this is also a way of thinking, because you're going to continue to have these problems in the future, and this is a pattern that ultimately the Jews have kind of had hammered into them that they need to pay attention to. Now, the exile is going to be a time when the great prophets are doing their stuff. So Jeremiah is kind of tangentially associated, but Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel are right in the midst of that, doing their thing. And if you remember, we talked about a lot of the minor prophets are either going to be in this, anticipating this, or writing after and helping us to understand what happened. Now, it doesn't last long. 587 to 539. So basically one generation is going to be in Babylon, but then they're going to come back in 539, and they're going to immediately begin to rebuild the temple. And for the next 400 years, they are, generally speaking, going to just be able to be the Jewish people they want to be. And so from about 539 through until about 140 or so, things are okay. This is when a lot of the minor prophets are kind of coming from this era. A lot of the wisdom literature comes from this era when the Jews have a moment to say, we're not getting our butts kicked all over the Holy Land. Let's think about things. Let's consider the history of the universe. Let's talk to the Lord and pray, and let's kind of embrace our Jewish identity when we're not hopping forth and back and forth between bad kings and good kings, or judges, or being conquered. And so these 400 years from 550 or so to 150 or so are really a moment when things are going really well. This is also a moment where the Jews are going to establish a pretty good relationship with the people who just conquered them, and we're going to have a lot of back back and forth now with the new Persian Empire, which is going to take over in place of the Babylonian Empire. And the Persian Empire is grounded in a religion called Zoroastrianism, which has a lot of faith in what the stars are doing. And in fact, this era is going to set the bedrock for a couple of Zoroastrian scientists later on named Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar to look up and notice that the constellation Virgo and the planet Jupiter and the constellation Leo and Mercury, Venus, and Mars are all coming into correlation, and the sun and the moon and all this stuff, and they're going to say there's a king rising in Jerusalem, because their connection with the Jewish people is going to give them the sense that the lion represents the tribe of Judah, and so on and so forth. So it's an incredibly important time in history. This is also an incredibly important time for politics in the entire known world, because this is the time when Alexander the Great and the Macedonian Empire is going to go around and conquer a bunch of people. It's the time when, after the Macedonians, or the Macedonians if you prefer, have conquered the world, the Jewish or the Greek culture that we call Hellenistic culture is going to spread all over. And as that is happening, the Roman Empire is going to rise up at roughly the same time, and they're going to be a very Greek-oriented culture. And so Greco-Roman culture is going to spread everywhere, including into Jerusalem. And at about 150 or so BC, the Roman Empire is going to start causing trouble, first culturally and then politically, in the Jewish state, in the what we would call Israel. In around 63 BC, Rome is going to show up and conquer Israel, and it's going to annex it as the province of Judea. The Jews are not going to like this. There's going to be a lot of back and forth. And in 44 BC, Julius Caesar is going to be assassinated, and his heir, the most important of all the Romans, Octavian Caesar Augustus, is going to come to the throne, and that is in 44 BC. It's a hugely important moment in world history. Octavian is going to brutally squash everybody who doesn't like him. He is going to be Mr. Insecure for the first 5 years of his reign, and the Jews are going to take a shellacking. They're going to take a beating. The Maccabees are going to try to step up and do something about it. It's not going to help. And ultimately, by the time then that Octavian dies, which is going to be in about 10 BC, everybody is Roman, whether they like it or not, and it's just going to be a thing. The Jews are frustrated that Greek and Roman culture are common in their cities, but it's not really a bad time. When they're not fighting back, all the Romans want them to do is pay their taxes. And so it's not all that bad. And that brings us to the end of the Old Testament. Once the Maccabees fall, in or around 40 or so BC, the Old Testament has nothing more to tell us. When the New Testament gets started, somewhere around 1 AD, plus or minus 5 years, we have the birth of John the Baptist, which is the first historical event of the New Testament. John the Baptist, of course, is the cousin of Jesus. He's about 6 months older than Jesus. And then everything is basically going to jump forward 30 years. Jesus will be baptized. He'll do his ministry for about 3 years until roughly 33 AD, again, plus or minus 3 or 4 or 5 years. He dies and rises in or around 33 AD, and the church begins at Pentecost. The apostles are going to stick together very briefly, mostly just to figure out what they're going to do, and then they're going to head out somewhere around 39 AD and go to their different directions and establish the church all over the world. St. Paul is going to show up on the scenes in the late 30s AD, and then he's going to show up again in the early 40s AD, where he is now converted. He has now spent time with St. Peter. He's spent his time in Arabia, and now he's ready to go out as a missionary, establishing churches and writing letters. Most of his letters, so Romans, Ephesians, Galatians, Corinthians, most of those are from the mid-40s and the early 50s AD. The Acts of the Apostles are going to be written down by St. Luke, who is traveling around with St. Paul at roughly the same time, probably toward the early side of the 40s AD. The Gospels will come together in the 60s and 70s AD, and that's around the same time that St. Peter and St. Paul will be martyred in Rome. The other letters, Hebrews, James, Timothy, are probably going to come, but we don't know as sure, from the late 60s and early 70s AD. St. John is the outlier. He's the only apostle who doesn't get martyred, not for lack of trying, though. And his gospel is going to be written later than anybody else's, probably in the 70s AD. But the book of Revelation is not going to be penned and in any kind of meaningful way until probably around 90 AD or so, making that not just the last book of the Bible in terms of theme, but also the last book of the Bible in terms of the time it is written. And so the New Testament is going to go from about 1 AD plus or minus until 90 AD. We know that date pretty well. The Old Testament is going to go from about 2000 BC, give or take, to pretty much 60 BC. Now, the only other note that I want to make is the Old Testament, and I've mentioned this a couple times, the Old Testament was written in a pile of different languages. It was written some in Aramaic, some in Uritic, some in Temple Hebrew, some in Vulgar Hebrew, and some in Greek. Now, those books, those papyruses, I said, many of them come from the court of King Josiah, but some of them come from other places. We know that some of them were probably written in like Alexandria, Egypt, and so on and so forth. And so there was an effort in or around 70 AD, so around the time the Gospels were written, in Alexandria, Egypt, where the great library was still functioning, to bring together a complete translation into one language of all of the Old Testament. No concern for the New Testament. This was a Jewish project. And so they brought together, as the story goes, 70 scholars who were given 70 copies of the original texts and put into 70 different rooms. And each one was told to make your own translation in prayer and in thorough study. And after the course of several years, all 70 copies were collected from these different scholars and compared, and lo and behold, they were all exactly identical, down to every jot and tittle, as we say. Now, this is obviously, kind of an apocryphal story, but this book, which was called the Septuagint, is in fact known to have been translated by a pile of people and to be translated in parallel with at least 10, 15 different people, and for the translations to be exactly the same in Greek. And so that is the book that we use to get the Old Testament. You might have heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found in the 30s and 40s in the Holy Land in the Middle East. Those scrolls were segments of the book of Isaiah and I believe the book of Ezekiel. And the reason scholars were so excited is that we have no original copies. And so when the scholars took the Septuagint in Greek and they rolled out the Dead Sea Scroll and they read the Hebrew in Isaiah and translated it, they were shocked to find that this version of Isaiah was really, really well translated into Greek in the Septuagint. That was the big deal that happened. And so we have a pretty reliable copy of the Old Testament in the form of the Septuagint. Part of Martin Luther's drama about what books would or wouldn't be used goes back to that text of the Septuagint, and also to the fact that when St. Jerome was collecting books for the Bible, mostly he used the Septuagint for the Old Testament, and then he went around and collected original Greek versions because everything in the New Testament is in Greek. And so when Jerome took the Old Testament Greek from the Septuagint and all the stuff he collected for different versions of the New Testament, he combined that whole thing into a Latin translation that we call the Vulgate, which was the official Bible of the Catholic Church until Vatican II, until 1960. And now we have a bunch of truly awful English translations translations to work from. But the Septuagint and the Vulgate were these big, huge, important kind of milestones in terms of Bible translations. And just because people will ask, the best of the modern translations is the Revised Standard Version. Ignatius Press has a Ignatius Study Bible, which is by far the best translation you can get. You don't want the NRSV, you want the RSV, and Ignatius is absolutely the best. And so if you're interested, that's the way to go. And that's a little bit off my topic, but that covers now the whole thing we want to cover. Next time, I'm going to do a little bit of a thematic review. It will not be in any detail, but we'll say, look, remember the first part was the Pentateuch. Here are the books of the thing, and this is what they said. Here's the history books. This was the basic idea of the history books. Here's the wisdom books. Here's the basic idea of the wisdom books. Here's the prophets. This is the basic kind of themes that rose out. So it will be a very, very, very broad overview, but this is meant to be a review and not meant to be a preview, and that will take us to the end of the Old Testament, and then beginning in the new year, we will be ready to kick off with the Gospel according to St. Matthew. Thank you for joining us for the last 70 some odd episodes that we have made through this. We have 20 some odd episodes to go, but I've enjoyed the heck out of it, and I appreciate you being with us, and we'll hopefully see you again through the New Testament, which will begin in the new year. I've been Father Ryan Humphries. This is the CU Catecast. I hope you have a lovely Christmas.